Jack is an Emeritus Professor in the Centre of Automotive Safety Research at the University of Adelaide and a Fellow of the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. An engineer with a doctorate in epidemiology from Harvard University, Jack has extensive experience in the role of the many factors which influence crash and injury causation on our roads. A past president of the International Council on Alcohol and Drugs and Traffic Safety, Jack has received numerous awards, including an International Distinguished Career Award from the American Public Health Association and an award for engineering excellence from the United States National Highway Transport Safety Administration. And tomorrow morning he's going to receive an award from the ITE for his contribution to the transport profession. More recently, Jack has been a member of the National Track Safety Advisory Committee of the Confederation of Australian Motorsport. So please welcome Jack.
Thank you for inviting me. When I was invited, I thought I'd better think about what I was going to talk about. So I jotted down 5 topics, and they're not meant to be by any means a comprehensive list of the things that are important in road safety, but it probably covers most of them. The first topic, crashworthiness. Crashworthiness, of course, was coined to be similar to roadworthiness. Roadworthiness is whether a car keeps going, and crashworthiness is whether if involved in a crash, whether the occupants survive. Interestingly, I think, the word crashworthiness was coined by a Melburnian, someone from Melbourne, Dr. John Lane, who was Director of Aviation Medicine in the Department of Civil Aviation. And in the early days of the manned spaceflight program, had complete authority to abort the program when the astronauts were over the Southern Hemisphere, if he thought it necessary. He never did. John attended the School of Public Health at Harvard University, and where he became friendly with Bill Haddon, and Haddon was the first federal highway safety administrator in the United States. And John's friendship with him was of great advantage to me in the time I spent there. I'm reminded of the saying that you can always tell a Harvard man, but you can't tell him much. So, anyhow, on the title of this talk is Successes and Failures in Road Safety in the past 60 years. Crashworthiness, of the topics that I'll just be talking about, has done pretty well in having more successes than failures. Going back to 1956 model year in the United States, model year for automobiles. It had been a research group at Cornell University had discovered that if you got thrown out of a car in a crash, it wasn't a very good idea. And the term thrown clear was very much a misnomer. The risk of serious or fatal injury was greatly increased. And the study, very large study they conducted, they found that people got thrown out because the doors came open. And the doors came open because the door latches were like latches on a door here. And if the body of the car distorted, the doors just fell open. If you look at a current model car, the latch is like that, so it'll withstand a certain amount of distortion of the car body before it opens. When this finding was conveyed to the car manufacturers, remarkably, in the one model year, all the main manufacturers changed their door latches so the doors wouldn't come open. And that very simple change in vehicle design, I believe, has saved many more lives and prevented much more disability than the invention of the polio vaccines. And that estimate was made assuming polio is endemic, in other words, an epidemic every year. But the two guys who conducted this research, who charged of the research, nobody's ever heard of them, whereas the person who, or the two people, Salk and Saban, who developed the polio vaccines, at one time at least, everybody had heard of them. Then talking about being heard of, the first person on my list here is Ralph Nader. Now, Ralph Nader wrote a book entitled Unsafe at Any Speed on the American automobile. Not just American, he had a go at the Volkswagen Beetle as well. General Motors didn't much like him because there was a rear-engined General Motors car, the Corvair, sporty car, but it kept falling over or rolling over in crashes. And so General Motors decided the way to shut him up was to blackmail him. And but unfortunately they got caught. And not only got caught, but at that time there was a congressional committee in the United States looking at whether there should be a federal, national traffic safety administration, which indeed there is now. But it was by no means certain the committee would recommend it. But when the president of General Motors appeared before the committee, they asked him, did he know anything about this attempt to put a tail, as they say, on Nader? He said, of course not. The next day he asked for permission to appear again and said to his great dismay, General Motors had hired the private detective. And the embarrassment of that was sufficient to, when the committee recommended the establishment of what is now the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, it passed through Congress with fewer dissenting votes than any other measure in history, other than the decision to declare war on Japan after Pearl Harbor. So Nader was very, very influential, continues to be influential, but particularly at that point. With the federal body being developed, vehicle safety regulation came into being. In the United States, it's called the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. They were restricted in the creation of these standards on basing them on existing standards in the car industry. It still was very useful because it meant that the worst cars were forced to come up to the level of that average at least, and the best ones would continue to be best. Soon after this, the Australian design rules for motor vehicle safety were introduced. John Lane, who developed the term Crashworthiness, was heavily involved in this. And they didn't have the restriction to only use existing standards, and so Australian cars got 3-point seat belts in the front and outside seats at the back, well before any other country. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine who worked at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the States, evaluating their programs, published a summary report where he said that from when the standards were introduced in 1960 through to 2012, I've lost my number. The annual number of lives saved in 2012 was 27,621, purely because of the existence of these standards. And if the standards hadn't been introduced, things would have improved, but nowhere near at that rate. It looked at one stage that the vehicle safety standards in the United States might be disbanded. When Ronald Reagan became president, he listened to the car industry, and the car industry at that time were not friends of safety. And so there was a rumour that he would disband the NHTSA altogether. That didn't happen, but the engineers there realised that they weren't going to get the new safety standards up. And so they developed a program where they tested cars, subjected cars from a safety point of view to slightly more severe crashes to see how they performed, controlled crashes. And this program was called the New Car Assessment Program. And the results were circulated widely in consumer safety publications. And today, NCAP, and there's an Australian NCAP, which was the first one outside the United States, that program probably has more influence than formal vehicle safety regulation in the design of cars. Now, there's the successes in crashworthiness. Looking for a failure, I found one here at home in Australia, and on bull bars. In 2002, Standards Australia issued a new Australian standard for frontal protection systems. They meant bull bars, but they didn't want to narrow it down to that necessarily. Part 1 dealt with the protection of pedestrians, particularly child pedestrians, if they were hit by a car with a bull bar on. I was very familiar with this work because I chaired the committee. But there were the intention was to have 2 other parts of the standard dealing with the effects of airbags on of bull bars on airbag deployment. That never got off the ground, and how effective a bull bar was in protecting the vehicle. And that never got off the ground, mostly because the most popular bull bars don't protect the vehicle very well. It was quite a learning experience for me, in that I came to realise Australian standards are not and do not demonstrate the best that can be done from an engineering point of view for safety. Rather, they are consensus documents that require the agreement of the parties involved in their development, including, in this case, the manufacturer of the bull bars, particularly steel bull bars, which are very, very dangerous. Consequently, the preface to the Australian standard mentions that it is based on child head impact criteria which have been included, incorporate values that are considered achievable. In other words, not too hard to achieve. But the European Union, which has a directive on bull bars, does not accept this view of what is achievable, and consequently the European requirement is much more severe than the Australian standard. The Centre for Automotive Safety Research at the University of Adelaide, where I lived for a long time, conducted some testing of the extent to which bull bars might be injurious to not just child pedestrians but adults also. And they concluded that the metal bull bars, whether they're steel or alloy, significantly increase the risk of severe death or injury to a pedestrian in the event of a collision. The third type of bull bar is made of plastic or polymer, they prefer to say, and in some cases they were actually less hazardous for a pedestrian than the front of the vehicle, and also in some demonstrations that the committee observed, more effective in protecting the vehicle. The aim of this work by CASA was to provide consumers with information on the risks to vulnerable road users, pedestrians, cyclists, associated with bull bars, so that they can make a more informed choice about whether to install a bull bar at all, or if they do decide to purchase a bull car, incorporate information on pedestrian safety into their purchasing decision. So much for crashworthiness. Distracted driving. It's interesting, I think, that 60 years ago there was considerable concern about the introduction of car radios distracting drivers. Today in Australia, of course, the concern is with mobile phones. And a police spokesman in Adelaide stated recently, the use of mobile phones distracts drivers from what they should be doing, paying attention to the road, he warned. Driving is a complex task and should be given the driver's full attention. It only takes a couple of seconds being distracted for a collision to occur. And I think most people would agree with that statement. However, in some other countries, in Sweden, for example, up until just over 2 years ago, there was no legislation at all in Sweden relating to mobile phone usage by drivers. So I sent an email to a friend of mine who was a senior researcher in the Road Authority in Sweden last week to find out whether that was still the case. And his reply is, as for mobile phone usage, the law was changed on the 1st of December 2013. You may still use the phone while driving, provided that you can do it safely. How's that for a rigid regulation? This is, of course, wording which gives room for interpretation. Generally, it's viewed as prohibiting texting while driving, but allowing the receiving calls as long as you don't need to look at the device and use its keyboard. So hands-free usage is considered okay. Still in Sweden. In the United States, one of the probably preeminent research group other than government is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. And it has conducted extensive research into the association between mobile phone usage and crashes. And its most recent assessment of this work 2 months ago is, it is not clear whether banning handheld phone use or texting reduces crashes, which is fairly dramatically different from the situation in Australia. On distracted driving in general, just over a year ago, in the southeast of South Australia, a 65-year-old driver did not see a light truck in his path when he was checking his GPS in his Nissan utility. The truck, following the initial crash, crashed into a four-wheel drive, and 4 members of 3 generations of the one family were killed. Checking a GPS takes only a moment, but there are many new cars on the road which have so-called driver aids that are much more distracting. For example, quoting the United States Consumers Union Vehicle Test Centre, which I think does by far the most sensible and most detailed assessments of not just vehicle safety, but vehicle performance. Their comments on the current model Audi A6 car. Complicated controls are a notable blemish on the A6. The multifunction controller in Audi's infotainment system is down on the console between the seats, where you have to look away from the road to see it. Menus on the crisp, clear and bright hideaway screen are well organised, but it takes several steps to dig in and reach the function you want. A touchpad between the seats lets you tap it for radio presets or trace out letters with your fingertip for navigation destination program, but it takes a while to program the system this way. It's also very sensitive to touch, so it's easy to inadvertently change the radio preset. Clearly, adjusting controls on an Audi A6 is infinitely more distracting than simply checking a GPS. It's not just Audi, the Lexus LS, the big Lexus. They said the biggest change from the last model year to the present one was the move to more complicated controls, including a mouse-like controller that moves around a giant centre dashboard screen. This represents a step backward compared to the relative simplicity of the previous touchscreen system. And then Mercedes, the big Mercedes. Door-mounted controls operate the power adjustments for the basics, including extendable thigh support. Things get a little wacky when it comes to the other seat adjustments. Lumbar height and pressure and shoulder support are all adjusted through the centre control knob. This takes several twists, prods and pokes to go through lots of menu pages. Doing it while driving is an extremely bad and distracting idea, but it does make for a super adjustable seat. And make sure to save your favourite settings in the 3-position memory, or you might never find them again. And for all cars, they do a summary of half a dozen reasons for buying this car, half a dozen reasons not to buy it. And I've copied out the first list of these for the Mercedes, which says pros, why buy the car? It's the best all-around conventional luxury sedan. Why not to buy the car? Infuriating controls. Now, all of this suggests to me that it is incongruous that a driver using a mobile phone is probably correctly committing an offence with quite a significant penalty if apprehended. And yet the top manufacturers of cars in the world can design cars that from one year to the next get harder and harder and harder to operate without taking your eyes off the road. It just doesn't make any sense. Another topic, seeing and being seen. I'm going to bring John Lane into the picture again. The first Australian design rules included a prohibition on tinting of the windscreen in the field of view. And this doesn't prohibit tinting across the top band, but rather where you're looking. This prohibition was introduced because Lane, as I mentioned, the Director of Aviation Medicine, said tinting of the windscreen of aircraft is not allowed, and so it shouldn't be allowed on a car. And in any case, he said, why tint the windscreen of a car when you can get the same effect by dimming the street lights and saving on electricity? And the introduction of this unique to Australia design rule prohibiting tinting was accepted by the committee that regulated or introduced the new design rules after assessing the literature, which consisted of something like 40 papers and reports on that topic. Around about in the late 1980s, this committee, the Advisory Committee on Safety and Vehicle Design, was merged with a committee on looking at aftermarket equipment for cars. And the most significant change was, instead of people like John Lane, experts in the field, the only people with voting rights in the new committee were appointed by the road authority in each state. And very often these representatives were not the same person from one meeting to the next. I was still on the committee as a representative of the National Health and Medical Research Council, and when it was moved that Australia should be tinting windscreens, I asked for the literature that had been reviewed 10 years earlier to be supplied to the voting members of the committee, and the Secretariat said that was too much work. And so I asked for the material to be available on request by the voting members of the committee. At the next meeting, I learned that nobody asked for the information in the literature, and so a prohibition of tinting was removed with no knowledge of the argument for it, such is life. Today, it is much more topical to consider front-side window tinting. In the early to mid-1990s, the International Window Film Association of Australia, which represented obviously the tint film industry, noted that the industry was worth $50 million a year in the early 1990s, probably much more than that today. And they said that there was no, and I quote their submission, no known correlation between window tinting and accidents. And so they argued for a change from the design rule requirement of 70% visual light transmittance through the front side windows, for that to go down to 35%, much darker, after a tint film had been put on the front side windows. This regulation making sure you can see through the front side windows is an international regulation which, in theory, Australia agrees to enact. And in fact, the current Australian design rule does say that you should be able to see through the front side windows. But the tint film industry nobbled one by one each transport minister in Australia to get them to agree to override, which they can do, override the relevant Australian design rule. I was given, when the Victorian Transport Minister, Mr Craigie, agreed to allow tinting of the front side windows, he instructed his vehicle safety person at Vic Roads, Bob Gardner, to draft a regulation allowing tinting, and this is a copy of it. The first part is the new regulation and the reason for it. But Bob Gardner then went on and said, the case against allowing reduced light transmittance is one of safety. Reduction in visibility both into and out of the vehicle through these windows is likely to reduce safety, particularly in poor lighting conditions. It is not proposed that this change be promoted publicly, as it is not desirable to encourage its adoption. Further, the change is likely to attract criticism from a number of road safety interest groups, particularly those related to pedestrians and motorcycle safety. We in Adelaide conducted a study of the effect of tinting, and I'll hand this around. It's on this side, it is a photograph taken through a front side window without tinting, showing a pedestrian about to cross where the car is turning right into a side street. The pedestrian was a secretary of, the wife of one of our researchers. She's blonde and was wearing white sneakers. The one below is taking photograph through the tinted front side window, and if it weren't for the fact that she's blonde with white sneakers, she is not visible. And the other side shows the situation where if you're coming up the blind leg of a T-junction waiting to see if it's safe to move out, and you're alongside a car on your right, that's what you can see if you, your front window, where the photograph's taken from, and the two front windows of the car alongside you are not tinted. You can see a cyclist approaching. If the windows are tinted, you can't see the cyclist approaching. So, not hazards of those. Which makes it incongruous that I think, that the tin film industry argue that there is no evidence for safety to be considered in this regulation. I also say that having some years ago purchased a second-hand car that did have tin on it, and after I nearly hit 3 or 4 cyclists at night, I took it around to a car servicing place and asked them to take the film off, and the look on the face of the mechanic when I asked him to take the film off was really quite interesting. I don't think anybody had asked him that before. I was flown over to New Zealand by the Land Transport Safety Authority twice when the tin film lobby argued for tin film on the front side windows to be made legal. They were successful. Interestingly, the head of their delegation was a previous Prime Minister of New Zealand, Sir Geoffrey Palmer, a very big man, physically big. At one occasion, over discussions in the corridor, I thought he was going to plant one on me, but he didn't, fortunately. The industry had their own expert who was wheeled in to, in particular, argue that the visual task through front-side windows really wasn't important, not like the windscreen. But it was rather ironical. This fellow's name is an associate professor of optometry at the University of New South Wales. At a seminar convened by the Roads and Traffic Authority in New South Wales in 1994, this person, Stephen Dane, said that he wasn't competent to argue the case for or against what the visual task was through the front side windows, but he changed his mind when possibly there was some encouragement given to him to say that. Curiously, a couple of years ago, I saw this in our daily paper, The Advertiser in Adelaide. There was a report about this optometrist who was arguing that energy-efficient light bulbs are good for the planet, but they can be bad for your health. The study of the compact fluorescent lamps as opposed to the older type. He said less light would reach the retina as the eye aged, meaning most people over 60 needed 3 times more light to see as adequately as they did in their 20s. As poor vision is a major risk factor for falls in older people, good lighting at home can help reduce this risk. And it was the same bloke, Professor Dane, said Australians needed effective lighting in their homes, as well as the correct spectacles and regular eye checks to make the most of their vision. But clearly they don't need effective lighting in their cars, which is unfortunate. But there is, sadly, no indication that the tint film will be permitted. Although I was sent, as it happened yesterday, an email drawing attention to the fact that in France, tinting in the front windows has just been made illegal. So maybe there's hope yet. Finally, on seeing and being seen, motorcyclists, at one time, the Australian standard for motorcycle helmets prohibited having a black helmet on the grounds of conspicuity. figuring that it was better for the motorcyclists to be seen by car drivers. This was changed because it was found that some motorcyclists, probably the ones who, when they buy a helmet, pull out the energy-absorbing liner inside the helmet, were painting their helmets black. And at that time, this is going back 20 years, at that time helmets, the cheaper helmets were made of a polycarbonate which became brittle if it was painted. And so it was decided that it was better to let them have brand new helmets that were black, which is a bit doubtful. There is also a standards committee on the characteristics of a visor on a motorcycle helmet. The chairman of that committee was this same Stephen Dane, who recommended and had passed a reduction in visual light transmittance. I think it was to 50%. I was on that committee and I asked what a motorcyclist was meant to do at night, and I was told he would change to a clear visor. But as many of you all know, many motorcycle helmets, the visor is moulded, and it's not something you put in your pocket and change it at will. Alcohol and other drugs. This is I'm just shuffling through has been a lot of publicity over recent years, 5 or 10 years, on the role of drugs in road safety. More publicity probably than is attached to alcohol and changes in alcohol situation, availability and so on. However, it is interesting, I think, that of the studies that have been done, it has been difficult to, not possible in fact, to show that the most popular drug, most widely used drug, marijuana, there is no evident increase in the risk of road crashes for people using marijuana. The first a study was done in Adelaide about 10 years ago, which found that indeed, as was already known, there was a significant concentration-dependent relationship between alcohol and culpability for an accident. These were drivers who were injured and had blood samples taken for drugs and alcohol. And as blood alcohol concentration increased, so did the percentage of culpable drivers. When marijuana was used alone, there was no significant increase in culpability. About a year ago, the first large-scale case control study in the United States to examine the crash risk associated with driver drug use was concluded. And again, the finding was, although marijuana-positive drivers were overrepresented in the crash-involved population, when researchers controlled for demographic factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, and alcohol use, they didn't find an increase in crash risk associated with marijuana use. It's also been argued that most drugs, not just marijuana, in combination with alcohol, make the situation much worse than if it was just alcohol alone. However, this major study concluded there was no difference in crash risk for marijuana-positive drivers who were also positive to alcohol than for marijuana drivers with no other drug such as alcohol beyond the risk attributable to alcohol. This study therefore concludes that the lower contribution of drugs other than alcohol to crash risk relative to that of alcohol suggests caution in focusing too much on drug driving, potentially diverting scarce resources from curbing drink driving. In Europe, there's been for some years now a major continuing study in 9 European nations on driving under the influence of drugs, alcohol and medicines. And their conclusion at present is alcohol is still the most prevalent substance in traffic, as well as it is among injured and killed drivers. Therefore, with regard to enforcement on psychoactive substances, it is recommended that this would remain to be mainly focused on alcohol use among drivers. Since enforcement of drug driving legislation is costly in terms of time and money, selective drug testing is recommended above random drug testing. However, drug enforcement should not be conducted at the cost of reducing alcohol enforcement. Which I haven't been following the situation in Victoria very closely, but I've been led to believe that those conclusions are particularly relevant. And finally, travelling speed. You need to be about as old as me to recall that in most states up until the early 1960s, there was no rural speed limit. There was what was called a prima facie limit, that if you crashed, you had to show that the speed you were travelling at was safe, which seemed to be a non sequitur. But it wasn't until the very early 1960s in South Australia that a rural speed limit was introduced, and the limit in metric terms was 110 kilometres an hour. What was not considered was that probably most of South Australia's rural highways were designed and constructed in the immediate post-war years, the late 1940s and 1950s. And the standard they were designed for was 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometres per hour. Despite this, it is often assumed when there is a proposal to reduce the rural speed limit from, say, 110 to 100, the fallacious argument is raised that if the speed limit was 110, the road must be safe to travel at that speed, which is not the case. In the United States in 1970, 72, 73, there was the energy crisis, and to try and save petrol, the US Congress introduced a new national maximum speed limit. It had been 70 miles per hour. They reduced it to 55 miles per hour to save scarce petrol. And 10 years later, the Congress asked for this to be revisited, and it was assumed that the argument would be that the lower speed limit should be retained because it was still a fuel conservation measure. In fact, that was acknowledged, but their main recommendation was that because in the first year that the limit went from 70 miles per hour down to 55, the mileage-based fatality rate decreased by 34%. And this is on the national interstate system, the safest roads in the world. And the summary of the congressional report was that reducing the speed limit was the most effective road safety measure ever enacted in the United States. And with the way of the world, 10 years later, less than 10 years later, 5 years later, Congress voted to increase the limit to 65 miles per hour, despite the fact that the recommendation that it was the most effective road safety measure. On speed limits in Australia, when metrication came about in 1974, the speed limit, the urban area speed limit was 35 miles per hour, and in most states, maybe all. And so a decision had to be made to metricate 35 miles per hour. Should it be 50 or 60? And at the time, the traffic engineers of the day believed that that was their choice, 50 or 60, because speed limits had to end in a 0 and advisory speeds in a 5, otherwise motorists would be confused. Now, I'm not telling lies, that was what the situation was. And so 60 was chosen instead of 50. I believe that it can be shown that by having a 60 kilometre per hour urban speed limit instead of 50, since 1974, about 3,000 pedestrians have died because of the higher speed limit. Finally, quantifying the risk of how crash risk varies with speed. They centred in quite a lot of work on that starting from the mid-1990s. We sent people out to 1,000 crashes in the Adelaide area, looking for cases where we believed that we could support an estimate of how fast the vehicles were travelling before the crash, which is not easy to do. And in fact, we were only able to come up with what we thought was a satisfactory estimate of travelling speed in about 150 out of the 1,000 crashes. We then went back to the scene of the crash a week later with a laser gun and measured the speed of the first 4 cars to come along in the same direction as the crash-involved vehicle, and compared the two speed distributions. From this, we concluded that travelling in a 60 kilometre per hour speed limit zone, travelling at 65 doubles your risk of crash involvement, and every increase of 5 kilometres per hour doubles it again. Now, this finding was described by people normally kindly disposed to us as being literally incredible. And we were very cautious when we first reported on it to make sure we said that this finding needed to be confirmed. However, it did convince people who developed the Australian road rules, and the default speed limit in metropolitan area was reduced to 50 kilometres per hour, but the arterial roads stayed at 60 in most states. When in South Australia residential streets were changed to 50 kilometres per hour, we compared 3 years before with 3 years after, and we predicted what the reduction in crashes would be based on our research, and we found that our prediction was conservative, but the actual reduction in crashes was even greater. We conducted a similar study in rural areas where we concluded that if you're travelling at, compared with travelling at 100 kilometres an hour, travelling at 110 kilometres per hour doubles the risk of casualty crash involvement. And that slowly, information is slowly filtering through, but there is a long way to go before speed gets the attention that it deserves.
What was the crash reduction in the residential?
Sorry?
What was the crash reduction percentage in the residential areas?
23%. The other comment, and the final one, would make of low levels of speeding in urban area. Well, first of all, it is most unfortunate that the speed limit was reduced to 50 only on residential streets, because in Adelaide 80% of the casualty crashes occur on arterial roads, which is still at 60. The other finding, which is that low level speeding, where driving at say 62 or 63 kilometres per hour in a 60 zone can contribute more, can increase the overpopulation risk of casualty crashes more than people travelling at 80 or 90. Obviously, at the very high speeds, the risk is very high, but there are very few, fortunately, people who travel at that speed, whereas a high proportion of the population will travel just over the speed limit. Just a week ago, this is our local area newspaper, the two local councils, one I'm the resident of, decided to ask the residents whether they would like 40 kilometre per hour limits instead of 50 in the council areas. And to reduce speed limits, a council is required to undertake community consultation in the target areas before seeking state government approval. At least 30% of residents need to respond to the consultation, and 2/3 of those need to support the limits. It's unfortunate that something as serious as travelling speed and the hazards associated with it are treated like I have trouble trying to think of the right words. Well, a popularity contest, I think, is what I'm trying to say. Anyhow, in conclusion, from time to time I get asked what are the three most important measures to concentrate on in road safety, and at the risk of sounding a bit twee, I answer speed, speed, and speed. So some people agree with me. Not many. I'll stop now.
I've got one to add to what you were just saying. I always tell my doctor that I've worked in road safety for 40 years, and I've probably saved more lives than he has.
Yes, indeed.
Engineers have saved more lives than the medical profession has, that's for sure. You probably feel good with that. So would we do a popularity vote and say, look, you've got cancer. Should we ask the neighbours what they think? Should we have a vote on it? Or do we look at the evidence, you know? And yet, with a health issue like safety on the road, we'll do a popularity. I don't get it either. Anyway, open up to questions and anyone else can have their say too. Go on.
I'm interested in comment on the design rules in relation to the accuracy of car speedos. my 2011 Volkswagen Golf is 8% out, and when I researched it, they were allowed to have 10% plus 4 kilometres out.
Which way is it out?
It displays less than actual.
Yes.
I would certainly think that it's best if it's accurate, so that people know it's under, then they'll try a bit over to make up for it.
Yes, I agree. The only time one of our cars, a Forester, we were driving back from Melbourne to Adelaide, somewhere around Ballarat. There's a place with an overpass or something, and on it tells you what your speed is. And I was sitting on 100, and it said I was doing 98, and I then came to realise that the trucks that are sitting on the back bumper, I suppose you could give them a little bit of, not complain too much. If their speed on it is correct, they don't like these people travelling at 98 in front of them. But clearly it's, and particularly with the penalties associated with speeding, it's highly desirable for a speedometer to be as accurate as possible. But you said that's 8 kilometres an hour.
Well, mine's 8 kilometres out, but when I looked at the rules about it, it's allowed to be 10% out plus 4 kilometres, which would be 14% out at 100, which seems crazy to me since this technology to have it accurate is easily there.
Indeed.
Any other questions? No.
Thanks, sir.
Okay.
In relation to
Could you
the
speak up so we
automotive
can hear your question, please? Could you speak up so we can hear your question, please?
All right.
In relation to the automotive industry and the wind down of it in Australia, how is that going to affect any work done on standards in Australia? Will there be enough people with the research background or the industry practice in the automotive industry for us to still make headway in relation to automotive improvements, vehicle improvements?
Quick answer is I don't know, but the car industry has improved its attitude to safety fairly markedly, but it wasn't all that long ago, 10 years, that the head of safety for Holden's said that the new car assessment program was a nonsense. And going way back to the 1970s and 80s, on the Advisory Committee on Safety and Vehicle Design, the main industry, there were two industry reps, it was a small committee. The main one was coined by John Lane. John Lane gave him the nickname Dr. No, but they would object strenuously to, well, they weren't helpful. The industry has changed markedly since then, but it's an interesting question of how much influence will be. In some respects, putting an optimistic hat on, in some respects you might get a better vehicle if it's designed overseas and it was designed here. Although I guess it's not so much design as awareness and alertness in looking for things that maybe are not as good as they should be in order to be changed. No, good question. When you've got a good answer, let me know.